My guest today is the Joy Junkie, Amy Smith.
I'm always allowing myself to share my emotions. So I have no problem crying in front of people, in front of strangers, in front of whoever. I believe that emotions are just messaging, and it's far more brave to show up in a vulnerable capacity than to sweep it under the rug. That's what we're taught to do. It takes way more courage to actually feel what you feel in front of people.
I'm Lisa Betts-Lacroix, and this is the Superpower You podcast. It's my pleasure and my purpose and my passion to highlight the amazing voices of the incredible people I know and some I've more recently met. Because I believe that our stories and our wisdom can and must change the world. I love to highlight the superpowers of all my guests, so you might hear yourself and your gifts reflected back to you. And with that, let's go. Hello, my lovelies. Welcome back to the show. So I just loved this conversation with my guest today so much. A big thanks to my episode number 44 guest, Lou Diamond, for putting us together. In my conversation today, Amy Smith, the Joy Junkie, shares not just her beautiful self and her personal story, but she also offers lots of wisdom bombs and practical advice. Some of the parts I loved the most are Amy's commitment to the practice of really honoring herself and her truth with compassion and kindness. Because sometimes when we're set on maintaining our boundaries, we can automatically go to this place of acrimony or even divisiveness. We feel like we have to get into that warrior self and instinctively sometimes lean into the fight of it. But as Amy emphasized multiple times in our conversation, the real beauty is in the ability to be assertive and real with grace and compassion. And speaking of grace and compassion, one of the things that was so special about this conversation is that Amy was willing to connect with me, to really have a conversation with me, and to invite me into this kind of interchange between us while still managing to keep the content thread alive. So I want you to listen for the sophistication of her communication style. And from a meta-learning perspective, notice her generosity, her conversational fluidity, and her ability to support the conversation and continuously returning to the idea threads. Another point I want to mention, something a bit different about this episode, is that we actually talk podcasting. Amy's a veteran podcaster, and so I took that opportunity to get some insight from her on podcast producing. And I was inspired to ask her about this because recently I've had quite a few friends and some listeners reach out for insight into how to start their own podcast. I think it's a time now when people are realizing that podcasting is not only a ton of fun, but it's also a fantastic way to contribute to your community and to raise awareness about your work. So, on that note, it's a great time to announce that I've become an affiliate for Pat Flynn's Power Up Podcasting course. And I have said it before on the show, and I'll say it again. If I had not done Pat's course, my launch of this show, my launch date would have been at least 4 to 6 months later than it was. In fact, in some instances, I was actually sitting in front of the computer, watching and listening to Pat's instructions, and then doing the next step by step, repeatedly. So the great news is that if you are starting your own show and you decide to purchase Pat's course through my link, you can also help keep the Superpower You podcast alive. So if you have any questions about the Power Up Podcasting course, feel free to send me an email with questions to hey@lisabl.com. But if you're ready to sign up right now, or if you want more information, just go to lisabl.com/PUP or PUP, which stands for Power Up Podcasting. That's lisabl.com/PUP. There's also a link in the show notes at lisabl.com/61. Okay, my friends, that is a long intro. So without further ado, let's jump into my conversation with Amy. My guest today is a certified confidence coach, masterful speaker, and personal empowerment expert. She's highly sought after for her uncommon style of irreverence, wisdom, and humor, which I know you'll be experiencing. She's the founder of the joyjunkie.com, and through her work as a coach, writer, podcaster, and speaker, she helps people find their voice and move to a place of radical personal empowerment and self-love. I want to welcome to the Superpower You podcast, Amy Smith, the Joy Junkie.
Yay! Hi, Lisa. I'm so excited to hang out.
So great to have you here. I'm excited to dig into all the areas that you speak and write about: attracting what you want and communication skills, making marriage work, making long-term marriage work, confidence, becoming badass, and all those things. And we're going to get into those topics and more. But I like to begin my conversations by asking people about something from their childhood or their families of origin. I'm wondering if there's something you can think of that perhaps informs who you've become and how you're showing up in the world right now that comes from your childhood.
Oh my gosh. How much time do we have again? Oh my gosh. Yes, I do. Very much so. So, a bit of context. I grew up in a very dogmatic, conservative, born-again Christian family. And as I've studied a lot and in my adult life, I've really realized that there were many things that were really borderline cultish, to be honest. A lot of guilt and fear and a very rigid set of what is right and what is wrong. And that was very hard for me, being somebody who was such a free spirit. And I had this very strong intuition. However, a lot of times I was being told that it was wrong. And that really kind of came to a climax in '07. And that was the year that I lost my father. He passed away. And at that time, I was involved in personal development as I am right now, but I had not really stepped into the element of finding your voice and really using it. Like all of the elements of communication, boundaries, speaking up for yourself, tough conversations, saying no, all of those things are really my sweet spot now. Well, they kind of had their genesis at the viewing or the funeral service for my father. So what happened is, well, a bit of history here as well. I have two younger brothers, and I don't want to be disparaging to them about their path, but just to give you a little bit of a picture, both of them have done jail time, didn't really, do much as far as betterment and advancing themselves with education. And I, had started working since I was 14 and, paid my way through college and got married and started working my way up in business and all these things. So there was kind of this stark contrast in the trajectory of our lives. However, I was kind of lumped together with them because in my mom's viewpoint, because we were not, quote, like walking with the Lord or, ascribed to all of the dogmatic doctrine, we were really kind of failures. And I had felt that pretty palpably most of my life or in my adult life since I had moved out. And so at the time of the service, prior to doing personal development, I was a makeup artist. So I knew that I wanted to do my father's makeup for his viewing.
Wow.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. That's really intense.
That's right. It was. So they call it mortuary makeup, but it's essentially applying makeup to a corpse, right? Yeah. And one that is beloved.
Yeah.
But I knew, that was my skill set at the time. And I felt like there was no way I was going to let somebody else do his makeup. That was kind of my perspective. And I also spoke at the service and he was a beautiful human. So there was hundreds of people there. And so I felt that I was really coming in strong on the good daughter that day, And so we get back home to my mom's house And she feels it the most opportune time to tell me, well, it just feels like we failed as parents because the three of you are not walking with the Lord. And I stood there kind of dumbfounded going like, are you kidding me? I just did makeup on my dead father. And I just spoke at a certain, like, and you have children that are failures? Like, wow. So the only thing that I could really muster in that moment, I was like, maybe this is a teaching moment. So I said, well, I don't think you should really say that to a child. And she said, well, that's just how I feel. And that time, that moment was really the impetus to understanding that a lot of times there are moments where it is an ultimatum. It is, I either choose me or I choose you. I make myself happy. I honor my own intuition. I honor my own integrity, or I make your wants, needs, and opinions more important. Now, I don't think that it's always that cut and dry and an ultimatum status, but that's when I really realized like there is a sacrifice of self that happens if you're concerned about making everybody else happy, if you're adopting that responsibility of everyone else's well-being and happiness. So what's really fascinating though is the trajectory right after that was I became extremely combative. So I sort of had this surge of, you know what, I'm standing up for myself. And so I sort of wanted to pick a fight. And so I would bring up really polarizing topics. And I was extremely adversarial. And there was times when I was like, Jesus, I really need to go back and kind of clean up a mess here. And again, we're talking over 12 years ago. So as I started working through that, and as I was getting more and more involved in coaching and personal development and building my career, really, I was like, oh, shit, I can actually speak up for myself and be kind and actually be nice. I don't have to be so combative. So that really became kind of the cornerstone of what I do now, which is teaching people to speak up for themselves, but to do so with grace and kindness. Most of the time we think if you speak up, you have to be kind of bitchy or snarky or only in the masculine, right? And that's just not the case.
Well, so, you just completely blown out of the water my next question, which is hilarious. I'm looking at it. I had this thing written down to say, oh, have you always been joyful? And how did you get that skill? And clearly that's you clarified that one right up. So I love how your story illustrates the fact that the path to joy often involves irreverence. So that's the perfect story to answer that question.
Well, what's interesting too, and just with what you're saying about have I always been joyful, and I don't know if this is really related to, I'm sure everything's related, right? But to the family of origin in particular, is I have struggled with really debilitating anxiety throughout my life. So I can very clearly say, no, I was not always joyful because I was in the throes of a very active nervous system that, that I have had under control now for the last 15 years. But prior to that, oh my goodness, I was quite manic with my emotions and did not have an understanding of what was happening in my physicality or my spirituality.
So what's been the path then to that? And first I want to say it's really interesting to me. I know a lot of people who I would call apostates who've left religions and different types, whether they've been Mormons or, Christians and who've left it. And I have this kind of attraction to it. And to people that have had that experience. And I think it's because I really am fascinated by profound change that requires honestly and deeply living into who you really are. And making a distinction between who you are as an individual and where your family of origin comes from, what your family of origin's history is. Because if you're going to leave a religion you've grown up with, it takes an incredible amount of honesty, I guess, self-reflection, bravery, courage, those kind of things.
Absolutely.
And I wanted to mention the idea of becoming badass, which you're already touching on. And I love the quote from your blog that says, becoming badass is truly loving yourself so much that you speak your truth, do it with grace, and handle yourself in a way in which you can be proud and really living on your own terms. And I think you're highlighting that as kind of a life philosophy that you bring to your own life and I guess to your clients.
Yeah, that's such a great summation. And what I see so much is that it's sort of a you versus me, or an us versus them, or you're right or I'm right and you're wrong. And so when there are these kind of polarized differences or differences of beliefs or opinions, it's easier for us to just make somebody wrong instead of saying, hey, good for you and your path. However, that's not my truth. Like, we don't have to be acrimonious towards one another. And so that really has been a huge, huge learning for me, that being badass, like for me, that definition is about doing and being who I need to be in order to be proud of who I am. And I feel like a badass when I deliver a boundary without being biting or acerbic. I feel badass when I decline an invite, but do so with grace and kindness and don't feel that element of guilt, like, oh, I'm letting someone down.
Yeah. And I love your list. You have a list on becoming badass, right? Which I'll link to in my show notes.
Oh, cool. Perfect.
Yeah. It's great. I love just the things like, did I say yes or no today? Right? Did I honor myself in different ways?
Yes, absolutely. Just kind of little checklists, because there's a lot of things I have found, particularly in the area of speaking up, where we have all of these terms like, oh, I don't want to open a can of worms, or better just sweep it under the rug, or I don't want to rock the boat. And we make it seem so culturally acceptable just to shut the fuck up. And what we're really doing is we're saying everybody else's wants, opinions, and needs are more important than mine. And the subconscious message is that I don't matter as much, that I am not enough. And so we start searching outside of ourselves in all sorts of areas in order to fill that. So I think it's massively important to understand that piece.
Absolutely. I want to, there's so many different directions that we can go in this. But one thing I want to just go back to, you mentioned that we don't necessarily have to approach things from the masculine. And I've been thinking a lot about, and this may be a segue into your relationship knowledge. And you also mentioned the idea of we don't have to be black and white. It doesn't have to be us and them. And I feel like our culture right now has us really having to look at the non-binary, right? It's coming up in so many different ways.
Yes.
We have historically had this good, bad, black, white, male, female, us, them, binary way of thinking about things. And younger generations in our cultural in general is really saying, hey, hold on a second. We might have to, rethink this.
Yes.
So I'm wondering, and this is kind of a bit of a broad, open question, but I'm wondering how you're thinking about that in terms of either a relationship or, how we deal with being women in the world, especially in relationship with men. Anything around that comes up for you? And I know it is really a broad question, but I kind of think we can play here.
Well, my first instinct is, and I know you're a huge fan of embracing emotions and like, let's talk about how we feel. And one of the things, as am I, one of the things that I see all the time is this idea of I can only really feel one way. So for example,
right.
If I'm unhappy in my job, then that must mean that I'm not grateful. And I'm like, no. You can be unhappy and unfulfilled in your job and grateful for having the job. You could be, unhappy in a relationship and grateful for all of the lessons that you've learned from that relationship. So a lot of times I think we look through the lens of one thing instead of allowing that expanse of multiple emotions. I think we do this a lot of times in our identities where we get really pigeonholed, like I'm an entrepreneur, or I am an artist or something. I am a mother. I am whatever it might be. And then we forget to nurture these other elements of who we are because we've thrown everything into one basket. So I think just expanding that and just asking your question, and I'm sure you could appreciate this. I don't know if you did as much theater. Did you do a lot of theater? I know you did a lot of television.
Yeah, no, I didn't. I didn't do, well, okay, first of all, I just want to say I so appreciate, I want to underline you're connecting that idea of the non-binary and the gray areas with both emotions and identity. So perfect. I just was getting shivers thinking about that. And then, yes, I absolutely want to talk about acting and I want to contextualize it. So in answer to your question, no, I didn't do much theater. I did some. Mostly I did film and TV. I did a lot of movies of the week. I did series television. I did feature films, that kind of thing. But I did go to theater school at Circle in the Square in New York and had the most amazing experience because studying acting is incredible. And I know from reading your blog about acting that you went back to study acting as both a life lesson and as an exercise in self-worth.
Absolutely.
I was cracking up reading your blog post about taking up the acting and loving the story about your little Irish life coach self having, getting cast as and I have to add highly articulate Irish life coach self, getting cast as a gun-toting, foul-mouthed loser rapper. That was hilarious. So I want to hear more about that, but I do want to create a context and a connection with you that I think is really interesting. I'm fascinated by. I've always said that for me, the years I was an actor were like an exercise in self-worth. And I saw my path as an actor as not only working on the skills needed to be an actor, but how do I stay present in myself and feel my own self-worth in the face of constant rejection that absolutely comes with the territory of being an actor. You can't avoid it.
Right.
And I feel like you wrote a whole series of blog posts on exactly that topic. So tell your story about deciding to study acting and what it was like.
Oh my goodness. Well, that is really fascinating because just kind of going back and kind of completing this concept of the binary. Yeah. One of the things that I love so much about acting is in the improv world, you don't really get to say, no, we're going to change the story. You always say, and.
Yes, and, yeah.
So that's the one thing that I would kind of offer everybody is if you're saying like, I'm just so frustrated and I'm also really grateful for this opportunity. Look for those ands instead of having that finite dead end. But my story, what happened was, it was quite fascinating. I was working with my coach at the time and I was kind of in a funk and just kind of a little bit like despondent, and asked her, or she asked me, she said, why don't we do some values work? And I was like, oh, okay, yawn, thinking, I know this already. I teach this. And so we start going through my values and I realized that there's a ton of them that I'm not honoring at all. And one of them that's paramount for me is human connection. And I realized that I had been kind of holed up in my office, kind of hibernating, being quite reclusive and not getting out and connecting with people. And at the same time, I wasn't involved in any massive creative project, which is another huge value of mine. So I thought, okay, you know what I'm going to do? I'm just going to go to the local junior college and I'm going to take an acting class because I know I need the structure of repetition. I can't just pick up an improv class. I'll never do it. So I needed that accountability. So that really was the impetus and got me doing a bunch of community theater shows. And I haven't done anything for the last 2 years or so due to some transition, but that's sort of the path that I ended up on. And then interestingly enough, I ended up befriending my director and mentor, and we ended up writing a curriculum, a college course curriculum specifically it was called Acting for Non-Actors. And it was essentially all of the personal development lessons that you learn from going into acting, like contending with fear, the imposter syndrome, all of those sorts of things. So it was brilliant. It was a brilliant experience.
Oh, that's amazing. So that's not available for the general public. It's not a book or anything yet.
No, it's part of a curriculum, a college curriculum.
Interesting. One of my other guests, Marilee Talkington, who is a film and television actress who's basically rising to some amazing, amazing heights right now. She also, in her early days of acting, when she was studying, wrote a book about the Zen of acting, which was quotes from what do you learn from acting. And so I love that we are collectively all sharing acting as, a personal growth path, which I think is one of the most exciting and beautiful things about it from my own past.
Oh, yes.
Yeah.
Absolutely agree.
So you're not acting now?
I'm not. No. My husband and I just a year ago moved from Southern California to North Carolina. So the last year has been a lot of rebuilding. And then prior to that, it was a lot of preparation. So I had to kind of triage what was the most important.
Right.
But I'm looking to get involved out here as soon as possible.
So let's actually segue into your relationship with your husband. You and your husband, who's also known as Mr. Smith, is, I don't know if he's the co-host. Well, you say he's the sidekick, not your co-host, right?
Right. Although he is turning into quite the life coach these days.
He is amazing. So the two of you talk a lot about relationship. And I listened to your very early episode, number 2, in which you shared about how you met working in a restaurant when you were only 18 and he was like 25 or something.
Yes.
And the sweetness of your relationship totally comes across then. That was 2013. And it still does now in more recent episodes. Like, you just have such a great chemistry. And so it's really easy to see why, like you say, people trust your long-term relationship advice. So I know you have a bunch of episodes and some blog posts and some freebies and worksheets on both attracting relationships and also maintaining and building relationships and making relationships spicy, all kinds of things around relationship. But from your perspective now, what do you say? Like, what are some of the key highlights around your knowledge around long-term relationship?
Oh, well, I think that probably the biggest influence that I've had is the work of John Gottman. So if anybody out there is interested in the dynamics which truly cater to a connected union, I highly suggest that you look into pretty much anything that he does. Mm-hmm. And a lot of what it boils down to is nuance and communication. And I know that sounds ridiculously cliche, but most of the time we speak and engage out of emotion instead of out of what we really truly want. So we scream and we yell, or we push it all under the rug, depending on if you tend to be a little bit more of a fighter or a fleer. And what happens is you start to communicate in a way where you cannot be heard. So however you feel is totally warranted. However, communicating from that place is not always the best choice in that moment. So what I oftentimes will tell people is, if you do notice that a bill wasn't paid or a ball got dropped or something like that, that just makes you seethe, those are not the times to start broaching the conversation. And a lot of times that's when we feel the most brave, right? And we go, I'm going to go handle this. I'm going to take care of this. Or we stuff it and we allow it to fester and build until there's a massive explosion. So a lot of what I will teach people is how to go through those sorts of things in a way that you can actually be heard a little bit easier, and to not necessarily dig your heels in so much in being right. Because every partner, whether it's a business partnership, family relationships, intimate partnerships, everyone thinks they're right. So digging your heels into trying to plead your case does not really get you anywhere. In fact, one of the things that we know is that people will not create change unless they feel understood. So if you're nitpicking your son for smoking, and you're just on their case all the time, they will not listen to you. There's no chance that they will change unless they feel understood and seen. So that changes everything for intimate relationships, collegiate relationships, anything like that, where we can communicate with each other with the hopes to understand where they're coming from. Then we can start to evoke change.
So from a practical aspect, how would that look? What would someone think about if they recognized their tendency to do what you're describing and they wanted to make a shift towards more relational interactions? How could they think about it? It didn't come naturally.
That's great. So the first piece is to allow yourself to expel the energy. So if it is vehemence, if it is anger, if it is, hostility, do something to expel that. And so that could be, primal screaming, that could be a workout, that could be beating the shit out of your bed, that could be journaling, scribbling, processing with a friend, a coach, a therapist, doing something so that you can approach a conversation with a cool head. And then what I would suggest is I call it gearing up, where you get out on paper the surface issue, like what happened, and then what the real issue is for you. So for example, let's say it's an intimate partnership and your partner tends to leave shit out throughout the house, or you just cleaned up everything, they leave their shoes out over and over again. You've asked over and over again. So the issue that you're pissed about is they left their shoes out or they didn't pay the bill. And they've always said they're going to take care of it, repeating the patterns. So your instinct is you just want to unleash on them. So you allow yourself to cool down, you gear up, you jot down surface issue is leaving the shoes out. The real issue is usually about your emotions, like what you are feeling. What does that mean to you? When your partner does that, what do you make that mean? And what that means oftentimes is something along the vein of they don't respect me. I don't feel seen. I don't feel like I'm a valuable partner to them. I don't feel accepted. I don't feel supported. I feel taken advantage of. It's not really about the shoes. It's about how you feel overall in the relationship. And that is what needs to be addressed. So after you've done your part, you've cooled down, you've journaled around some of this stuff to figure out what is the real issue. Then you go into the conversation. And again, this is work that I teach that kind of spans over 6 weeks. So I'm giving you a very, Cliff's Notes version. But then when you go to talk to your partner, you're in a cool head and you can own your piece in the matter. And you can say something like, hey, I really got upset today and I realized that it was actually about something so much bigger and you probably would have no idea. And I've never really communicated and shared that with you. And that's totally on me. And I would love to just kind of share with you what happened for me. When you left out your shoes or when this happened, here's what happened for me. Here's the story I made up, that he doesn't care. He doesn't respect me. He doesn't think that I'm valuable, blah, blah, blah. And I don't necessarily think that's fair that I made that whole thing up without asking you. So, but all of that happens, those sorts of conversations happen through practice because nobody teaches us that.
Right. Yeah, totally. I mean, I think the piece of owning what you're making something mean, owning the story and recognize it as such is such a powerful thing to say, even though I feel this way, I felt this and I felt this because of my story about it. And I think I think you're right. It does not come naturally. It's really, it's not the way we behave when we're in our ego, right? About being right.
Yes.
So.
Well, I have a perfect example happened with my husband and myself, probably, I don't know, maybe 2 years ago or so, where I was like, oh my gosh, I just did it. So we were in the process of making some renovations to our home at the time. And so my husband had put a bunch of things in the living room. Well, the living room is where I oftentimes would do my workouts. So I was following this yoga instructor named Dylan. So I would call my workouts my dates with Dylan. So my husband asks me one day, the only thing that he said was, are you still doing your dates with Dylan? And I said, oh no, I haven't been doing them lately. And in my mind, Lisa, I went to, oh my God, he thinks I'm so gross and slobby and fat. And he wants me to work out. He's not attracted to me, blah, blah, blah. So I caught myself in that moment, right? I'm like, okay, Amy, okay, blurt it out. And so I said, hey, babe, I just want to share with you where I went in my mind. Tell me if I'm totally making this up. And I said, when you said that, this was what happened for me. And he goes, oh my gosh, no, I had so much shit in the living room. I wanted to make sure if you needed space that I could move that out so that you had the room to do it.
That is hilarious. What a great illustration of that point. That's amazing. The idea that our brains go to this different thing and we make these stories up when actually what happened,
right,
is something as simple as the comment that your husband made.
Right.
It's such a great illustration.
Well, and then we start gathering evidence. So imagine had I not said anything.
Right.
And then let's say we're watching television and he goes, oh, wow, she looks really beautiful or something like that. I would gather that as evidence, like, oh my gosh. Or
it's true. He does think
exactly.
I need to work out more.
See, and it can all be handled if we just use our words and if we just talk about what's really happening for us. Mm-hmm. And that is vulnerable. And that is the biggest obstacle. I know you've talked about that before on the show, that our vulnerability is, we're like, no, let's build walls. Yeah. Because it's safer, but it's also far less intimate, far less connected.
So true. I mean, that connection between taking the risk to be vulnerable, share ourselves, and be in communication with our true selves. Wow. Scary, terrifying, vulnerable. No. But there's the path to the intimacy, right? And to connection.
Absolutely.
So, yeah. So this is a little bit self-serving, but I want to pick your brain a little bit about podcasting, because you've been podcasting for almost 6 years. So you're like a pioneering trailblazer of the podcasting world. You have almost 300 episodes, right?
Yes, I do.
And I'm a year in, 52 episodes in, having an awesome time and still have so much to learn. And I'm wondering if you would be willing to share with me. And I know many of my listeners, I've heard from many people asking me about how they can start a podcast. So I know people are just thinking about it. What would you share with me now that after almost 300 episodes that you didn't know, say, in the first year at the beginning?
What did I not know? Well,
or what advice would you give? Hey, Lisa, think about this.
Well, one of the things that I definitely would advocate is the consistency, that there's some sort of rhythm and pattern, whether you do a weekly show or you do seasons or things like that, that will always get a much stronger listenership. And, I've learned so many lessons. And part of that has to do with the fact that I have my husband on the show with me as well. And for some of the earlier episodes, I would get so frustrated with him because I was up against some control issues. And I'd be like, you're not saying. So I would say something and then he would go, but that's just so hard to do though, and I'm like, you're not helping. So we had to work through some of that, and it became incredible to connect. And now we have an amazing rhythm. So I don't know if that's as helpful, but I have noticed that there are a lot of things that I had a death grip of control around. I think a lot of kind of recovering perfectionists might be able to relate, where if there was any sort of background noise or I stumbled over a word or that I would want to splice it out and make it all perfect. And I've really loosened the grip on that because I've realized that people really don't give a shit. They just want the bulk of the message and they're in it for the learning and what they can take away, as long as it's, within reason. But I
think I needed to hear that because I definitely recognize that.
Yes, that's huge. But I mean, that's sort of a metaphor for everything, right? Like we just
generalizable for sure.
And I would also be really vigilant about pulling your audience and what they want to know. So I always have had an option to submit show topics. So I start to get a real feeling for what people really resonated with, and then what was really challenging, or, hey, I know you talked about this. What about when this happens? So that was really helpful. And then as a podcast, producer, essentially, you start getting your content handed to you. Because mine is a little bit different because I don't have guests. So I come up with everything every single week. So it's so useful for me to know what people want to hear about.
So from a logistical point of view, you have a lot of content, you have a lot of episodes, you have a lot of downloads and worksheets and audio. And I mean, you do a lot. So I'm imagining you cannot, plus you have a business and coaching and all kinds of other things. So what parts of it do you still do? And I'm imagining it's different now than it was when you began. Do you do any of your own editing?
No, my assistant does that. So I have a brilliant assistant who I absolutely adore. And so, this is another piece of advice that I would definitely throw your way, because I did not always do this, but we have a very rigid system. So I basically trained her on all of the pieces that I really like, don't like, things like that. And we have a really well-oiled machine. So my husband and I record usually at 11:30 on Wednesday mornings. And then I get her all of the components that she needs. And we're usually 2 weeks in advance. So then she will usually have that ready by Friday, and then it won't be released for another 2 weeks. So I know that I can't delay on creating an agenda. I can't delay on that project because she's relying on me. So that has also made me a lot more rigid with the time. But then we've been really flexible. So, one of the great things about having such a vault of past episodes is, I was dealing with some health stuff in September. And so I took about 4 weeks off of the show, and we just did a bunch of community favorites. And we looked at the things that had been really popular over the last couple of years, and we just rebroadcasted them.
Did you redo an intro to them and say, this is a rebroadcast?
Well, because sometimes I do, not always, but this time I was so kind of incapacitated due to the health stuff that my assistant got on there, and she did the intro and said, "Hey guys, Amy's not feeling the best," and she wanted to really model self-care, and which was totally true. And then she said, "Here's one of our most popular episodes that we've seen, on the show, and hope you enjoy." So that there's constantly something coming through the feed, but that I could have a massive piece of peace of mind and break and all of that.
That is a great idea. I could have used that advice a month or so ago when I was dealing with something similar. And I hope your health is improved and you're feeling better from.
Oh, radically, yes.
Good. So, okay, that's fantastic. Thank you so much for that insight. Now, we are on the Superpower You podcast, and we cannot not talk about your superpower. And I usually give a context for that. And the way I see a superpower is that skill set or that strength that has been with you your entire life, regardless of your age or your stage or your business or your work, and that is so natural to you that it's like the air you breathe or the water you swim in. And so you might not even necessarily recognize it, but to other people, it looks like you're scaling a vertical hill. And a lot of times people don't discover their superpowers until they've had it reflected back to them many times. And they might even at first say, that's no big deal, because it's so innate to them.
Yeah.
So with that context, I'm wondering if you have a sense of your superpower.
Yeah, I definitely do. And it's really funny because I actually use that exact moniker when I talk about it. Yeah, I call it my superpower. So I realized this as I've run a lot of in-person groups and retreats and events and stuff. So when we get to the point, well, truly, like throughout the entire duration of the conference or the retreat or whatever, I'm always allowing myself to share my emotions. So usually what that really means is I have no problem crying in front of people, in front of strangers, in front of, whoever.
Yes.
I believe that emotions are just messaging, and it's far more brave to show up in a vulnerable capacity like that than to sweep it under the rug like most people. I feel like that's what we're taught to do. It takes way more courage to actually feel what you fucking feel in front of people.
Yeah, with you, sister, with you on that big time.
I had this conference that I did a few years ago, and we were all kind of going around the circle, and I'm just bawling my eyes out while people are talking and just feeling it and just really embracing the beauty of these spirits that I got to connect with. And so one of my co-leaders looks over at me, and she just kind of like smiles and kind of shakes her head like, "Oh, Amy," and so everybody kind of looked over at me, and I'm like, "It's that's my superpower, you know? And now I really foster that in a lot of my students. So the people who have been told their entire life that they're too sensitive or they're too emotional, they're like, oh, no, that's my superpower. It takes courage. It takes bravery.
So I'm kind of big on naming. What would you name that?
Oh, gosh. My first thought was vulnerability, but I don't know.
It sounds like it's more about expressing emotions or,
yeah, definitely emoting, maybe.
Emoting. Yeah.
Freedom of emoting,
yeah. Emoting as a superpower, something like that, or emoting as strength,
like
or emoting as, something along those lines.
It's just honoring your humanity.
Yeah.
It's just another piece of our body sending us messaging. That's it.
Love it. Beautiful. So 3 nuggets of life advice gleaned from your journey so far. Now you've already shared a lot. So, at the risk of being a little greedy, and maybe from a broader point of view, like you come to this place in your life, you're doing the work that you're doing. And if you had to share, a couple of nuggets of wisdom with my audience, as a practice or a way of being or a way of showing up in the world, what might you say?
Oh, a couple of pieces. One, I would say, no matter where you are, to really keep in mind the element of compassion. Because I think we're kind of in a surge here where there's so many thought leaders and that we have so much access to self-help and personal development. And it's so easy to see people and go, oh my gosh, well, why do I still have a hard time speaking up to my in-laws? Or why do I still think I'm not enough? And well, they can figure it out. And so we tend to judge our journey.
Mm-hmm.
So I would say, keep in mind that everybody else has a behind the scenes as well. And it's not always sparkly and beautiful. And that wherever you are right now is exactly where you needed to be to learn specific lessons. And so if you actually look for what is my lesson, the what, instead of why am I this way or why did this happen to me, shift that into what am I meant to learn through this experience, especially if it's quite trying. So that's one. Number 2, I think this is huge, and I cannot underline this enough. Please recognize that our personal growth journey is never done. I think people tend to beat themselves up if something comes up again. I know for myself, with what I shared earlier, there will be triggers that hit me around religion, around spirituality, even God, that I get kickback around, and I have to check in. And I think a lot of people will go, I thought I already handled this. God damn it. I thought I dealt with my mom issues or, whatever it is.
Right. Grief is like that too, right? Circles back around.
Grief. Oh my word. Yes, absolutely. So to just know that the journey is the win, my friend, and anything that's popping back up is just a new lesson. That's all. And then finally, I would kind of circle back to what we talked about earlier, to start looking at areas in your life where you might be making up a huge story. And it might be noticing times when you're convinced that somebody's pissed at you, or you're replaying a scenario that happened at work or something like that. Just stop and ask yourself, what am I making up? Because a lot of times there's the facts of the situation, what was said, what was done, and then there's what you infer from that, what you have created from that. So start the process of just mentally untethering those things. So I think that those are the 3 that I would leave you with. I hope that will suffice.
Amazing. Oh, fantastic. Just so beautiful. I'm so thrilled. Before we wrap up, can you tell my listeners, and I will of course put links in my show notes, but just in an auditory way, just tell my listeners where they can follow you, find you, get more information, listen to your podcast, all that stuff.
Yes, absolutely. If you cruise over to thejoyjunkie.com, you'll find my little corner of the internet, and junkie is just spelled Junkie, and you'll see access to the pod over there. My show is on tons of platforms, but iTunes, Stitcher, and it's just called The Joy Junkie Show. And I hang out the most in social media on Instagram. That's kind of my preferred platform to communicate with people. But yeah, go over to the site, tons of things for free, as you mentioned. And I would just be honored if anybody dipped their toe in and if it was helpful.
Absolutely. My listeners absolutely should listen to the Joy Junkie. I am a fan of you. I'm grateful to you.
Oh.
Thank you so much for sharing your wisdom. You're so articulate and beautiful and deep. And I'm just really grateful that you took the time to come on the show today and to talk with me and share your wisdom with my audience.
Oh, I've had such a blast. The feeling's mutual.
Okay, my friends, was I right? So good, huh? I'm going to let all that sink in now. And once again, remember, if you're starting a pod of your own, visit lisabl.com/PUP or pup, lisabl.com/pup, and get the incredible benefit of an amazing program that will ease your path to launching and will help keep me bringing you super cool guests like Amy. So until next week, I'm sending you love and hugs.